Pain on the front of the shoulder with things like bench press and push-ups, it could be the biceps tendon. In this video, we'll go over an exercise progression for biceps tendon pain. The first thing that you should know about biceps tendinopathy is there's two different types. We have primary and secondary. Primary is the result of direct overloading of the biceps tendon. And this can be the result of tensile loading, which occurs when the shoulder goes into flexion, or it could be compressive loading, which occurs when the shoulder goes into extension and that biceps tendon is compressed against the head of the humerus. The second type of biceps tendon pain occurs as the result of some other shoulder condition, like shoulder instability or a chronic rotator cuff tendon issue. And so if that's the case, we'd want to address those because those are what's actually leading to that biceps tendon pain. And those can be identified through a thorough history and an exam. If we look at the anatomy of the biceps, it crosses both the shoulder as well as the elbow. So not only does it help with elbow flexion, it also helps with shoulder flexion as well. And so if we're looking at loading the upper portion of the biceps tendon, then we want to emphasize that shoulder flexion. For a biceps tendon that's really sensitive to loading, isometric contractions can be a useful starting place. Most of the load for the biceps tendon occurs less than 30 degrees of flexion, so we want to start to load somewhere in this vicinity. Generally going into extension puts some compression on that biceps tendon, which leads to some more irritation. So initially we want to start with our arm in front of our body. And so these holds are generally held for about 30 to 45 seconds and then repeated for 5 repetitions. We want to make sure that we're using sufficient amount of weight depending on whatever our tolerance is. If we're looking at trying to get the tendon to adapt, we need to use about 50% of our max. So it's a pretty hard hold. We don't want it to be super easy, but we also don't want to load it too much where we cause some more irritation afterwards. And these isometric contractions can be progressed so that we're loading more into extension. So we can take a little bit bigger of a step so that when we're holding here, our arm's in a little bit more extension. And then again, we can go a little bit further here so that we're getting the tendon to adapt into more extension. Next, we'll load the biceps tendon through a range of motion called isotonic loading. So they're going to be very similar to those isometric exercises, but we're just going to move between all the positions. So I like to call these bowler curls, where we're going to start and then just slowly curl up to about 30 degrees of flexion and then back into extension here. And so we want these to be slow contractions. So it should be 3 to 4 seconds in each direction, and then 3 to 4 seconds back to that original starting place. This makes sure that we're having sufficient time under tension to get that biceps tendon to adapt to the load. And we can modify these to start loading the biceps tendon in some different planes as well. Instead of going into flexion and extension, we can almost go at a diagonal pattern, so like a modified fly. And we want to start in flexion, so that way we're not loading too much in extension, just in case the tendon gets irritated. And then it's the same motion, but we're almost going at that diagonal pattern. So loading into extension, and then flexion as we kind of come up and across through the body. And depending on the demands of the sport that we're returning to, if we're going back to something like CrossFit, Olympic lifting, or baseball, where the shoulder is going to be exposed to some explosive movements, we want to make sure that that biceps tendon is able to tolerate those quicker loads on it. So we can modify some of the exercise to incorporate some speed work as well. So we can go back to that isotonic loading, and then we can go with some faster movements, so that way we can make sure that the biceps tendon is going to be able to tolerate those quicker loads when we return back to sport. If the biceps tendinopathy is secondary to a rotator cuff tendon issue, then there's a really good chance that we're going to want to include some rotator cuff strengthening into the rehab program. The most commonly involved rotator cuff muscle is the supraspinatus, which is on top of the shoulder blade. And so we might incorporate something like a lateral raise to start loading the supraspinatus. And these are typically performed in what's called scaption. And so instead of straight out to our side, they're actually a little bit forward. And the reason why is because it's more in line with the shoulder blade. Another common rotator cuff exercise are external rotations, and this primarily works the infraspinatus and teres minor muscles, which are on the back side of the shoulder. This can be helpful with a biceps tendon issue because it can pull the shoulder back, which can decrease some of the compression on that biceps tendon. We can also work the scapular retractors, so as we're externally rotating, pulling those shoulder blades together and then coming back when we're doing our external rotations. These external rotations can then be progressed to have our arm at a higher elevation. And this can be helpful because it more similarly reflects the position of the shoulder when we're doing a bench press or a push-up. And obviously there's a ton of different rotator cuff strengthening exercises that we can choose from. And this choice really depends on what is going on, whether it's shoulder instability or maybe a chronic rotator cuff tendon issue, and also what the tissue's tolerances are to load. But these are just some exercises that we can use to get started. So hopefully this video on biceps tendinopathy was helpful. If it was, go ahead and give this video a big thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, hit the subscribe button over here, bell icon down below. And then I'll also put a couple of shoulder videos over here as well. I'll see you in the next video.